this stuff is lived out,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what's so cool, I think, about being a pastor, is really we get to be a part of people's lives and speak into it in so many different ways through worship and song and scripture and just sitting by those bedsides, through celebrating births, welcoming new members into the body through baptism, gathering around the table as we celebrate communion. Just all of those things are just sometimes the coolest thing I think about being a pastor is that trust that
Mm-hmm.
I have, that people invite me into some of the most sacred and most intimate moments of their
Mm.
lives.
Welcome to Faith and What Resonates, a podcast that explores the intersection of faith, spirituality, music, and the nature of inspiration. I'm Gail Gallagher, and I'm a professional musician and lifelong seeker. I was raised both Catholic and Unitarian Universalist at the same time, and as I grew up sorting my theology, I found my spiritual ground in music and theater. On this show, I interview folks about their faith journey and the role music plays in their lives as we explore the magic of the things that resonate. My guest today is the Reverend Michelle Byerly. I have known Michelle since my freshman year of college, and I am so glad that we have been able to reconnect through starting the New Faith New Media Network together. Michelle is a pastor in the Great Plains Conference of the United Methodist Church. She also co-hosts the podcast A Pastor and a Priest Walk into a Movie Theater. Note that when we recorded this episode, I definitely thought the name was Priest and a Pastor, so if you hear the reverse order, that's what's going on there. In this conversation, we discuss the Methodist hymn, "O for a Thousand Tongues to Sing," as well as the history of Methodism in general, which includes a dramatic reading of the instructions in the Methodist Hymnal. We talk about finding meaning in the sacraments, ritual and intention, how hospital chaplains are spiritual rock stars, and other points in between. Without further ado, here's our conversation. Welcome to another episode of Faith and What Resonates, and today we have the Reverend Michelle Byerly. And I have known Michelle since college.
You've known me before I was the Reverend.
Yes, exactly. I've known you since before you got the Reverend.
Yes.
Back when we were taking physics over the summer, and
even before that, we met at a social at our nerd dorm.
Yes. So we both went to University of Nebraska-Lincoln,
Mhm.
and we met in the dorms, and hung out all through college.
Yeah. And then Gail dragged me to some Shakespeare along the way and made me fall in love with that. So, yes, Gail and I have known each other for a very long time now. As I was thinking about it, gosh, that would be like 15 years if I am allowed to date ourselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That was 15 years. You're getting
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah.
That's wild. So, Michelle, go ahead and tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your faith background and what you do in the world.
Yeah. So again, I'm Michelle Byerly. I serve as United Methodist Pastor in the Great Plains Conference. These views, of course, are my own in the midst of that. And we cover, so in the Methodist Church, an annual conference, one way that it refers to is a geographical area. And I serve the Great Plains, which is all of Kansas and all of Nebraska. And I can be appointed to serve any church or churches within that geographical area. Right now, I'm in north central northwest Kansas, and soon I'll be moving back to Nebraska where I grew up. So it's I'm looking forward to that a little bit. I was a cradle United Methodist along the way, but no one else in my family had been in ministry. I was always the one who in my family would be like, let's pray at dinner, or I liked going to church, and I was a little weird like that. Sermons, but for me, the music was always my favorite part of the service. And just learning about faith along the way. It was just kind of part of who I was. And then when I was in high school, my brother was diagnosed with cancer. And so he was going through treatment at the time. And we weren't able to stay in the church as much, but we definitely felt the support there. And our faith definitely was the glue that carried us through as a family along the way. And then when I started at college, I knew that it was going to be important for me to take that responsibility for myself. And so I got involved with the campus ministry that was there at the time. That was this ecumenical group of United Methodists, United Church of Christ,
Did we
Disciples
go
of
to that
Christ.
together at some point?
I'm trying to remember if you came to that at some point or not. It's not coming to my mind, but it's not impossible that you would. I could see you doing something like
There
that.
was some non-denominational group that met in the student union, and I remember singing like some like hip Christian rock songs and hanging out. And
I don't recall. We weren't that
okay,
hip.
okay. It
I'll
was
just
some
say it
group.
that way. Yeah. So we had all those kinds of things on campus.
Mhm.
Just all these different groups and the street screechers and the
Oh my goodness.
yeah.
Yes. I would get in debates with the street preachers sometimes.
Yeah. I
That's
eventually just learned to walk on by. So that is, and I talk about that because that is an important part of how I have come to faith and how I approach sharing my faith.
mhm.
I think I think that the best thing that we could do for my Christian faith is to be open and say, "Yes, I'm a Christian," and then not be a jerk about it. I mean, I'm just so frustrated by people who use Christianity for their own agenda or use it for harm.
Mhm.
That's for me, that has been a big part of my getting into ministry. My understanding of God is very much a God of grace and love, and who kind of binds the world together with this creative energy. And so that's why when you were describing what you're doing, I was so excited too, because I think there is a huge creative element to
Mhm.
who God is and how God works. And so for me, I always wanted to be a part of sharing that with the world. And for me, growing up, the sacraments of baptism and communion were so important to me. And as I was in college and trying to decide what I wanted to do with my life, as you do in college, I started out as a biochemistry major and ran into the buzzsaw of calculus to physics to cell biology. And I just was really struggling with them. And I realized that part of it was I wasn't, I could get it, but it was a matter of was I willing to spend the time and energy that it took to gain the level of proficiency at it. And for me, it was like, not so much. And so I did some thinking and switched. And I've always loved language and literature and movies and books. And so English was very much a fit for me. And then I also was like, but I also love trying to understand people and why we do the crazy things we do. And so
Mhm.
I did the double major in English and psychology and switched into that. And then I was still kind of, what am I actually going to do? What does one do with the BA in English when you graduate?
Mhm.
um, and I realized, there was just that still small voice that said, ministry could be an option here. And for me, it was the rational. There was that piece of me, but then there was that logical, rational side too that was very much, I enjoyed spending time in my campus ministry. I enjoyed being part of that. I enjoyed the sacraments and all of that. And I was like, if that's where I'm spending my time and enjoying and finding the energy, then maybe this is something to pursue.
Mm.
And so I continued on that path and decided, okay, if I'm going to do this, seminary is the next step, and ended up going to St. Paul School of Theology in Kansas City, and met a lot of great people. And the nice thing about seminary is you are around a bunch of people who are just trying to talk about what it means to believe in God and the church and how we live out that crazy thing as
Mhm.
community. Um and so for me, I really enjoyed that time of getting to know that. And then I've been pretty much serving churches ever since. I did 2 years of clinical pastoral education as a chaplain
Okay.
at the University of Kansas Hospital. And so I've mentioned my brother was diagnosed with cancer when I was in high school, and he passed when he was 25. So I was actually in seminary. It was between my first and second year that he had passed.
Ugh.
And for me, I realized between the campus ministry that I attended in college closing as I was graduating, my seminary moved from one location to another. The death of a very close family member, I've realized that grief and loss are a huge part of the work that I do as well. I think that it's important that we acknowledge those things, and I know it's tough. You know, the you've had your own experiences as well, and that loss is there. But I also think it's kind of become a friend on the journey for me
Mm.
in the midst of it. You know, it's been this opportunity to say, you know, that's part of life. And yet there's a lot of grace in the midst of it as we remember those people, as we talk about, you know, what does it mean
Mhm.
that we are all mortal and that we are, that we do have this experience. And so what do we make of this world that we live in
Yeah.
and our experiences?
Yeah,
So,
I resonate with so much of that, and I did not realize that timeline had synced up for you like that to be in seminary when your brother passed, and that
mhm.
is that's a lot.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and it's interesting. I look back on that now and I'm like, how in the world did I ever survive that? And I think a lot of it is just a lot of grace,
oh yeah.
you know.
Yeah, and I think being in a place where you're studying, how to you're already studying how to find that, higher self and like find that discipline and stuff like that. That is yeah, I in my experience, it was like I went on the big old journey of self-discovery like in
Mhm.
light of the loss, but like,
Yeah.
um, but that's really beautiful. And I have to say, like, hospital chaplains are rock stars. They are
Mhm.
actual rock stars.
Yeah.
And I know in my experience of loss, like, um, and it, like, especially being Unitarian Universalist, like when you're like, okay, like the moment that I had with losing my mom, which I'm not going to go too far
Sure.
down that road down
Sure.
there, but there was a definite moment of, okay, you can pray to the god of whatever name you want, but you're going to call on all of them to help you through this transition, and like this
Yeah.
realization of like, okay, it's all theoretical and you can play all these theology games in your head, but when the rubber meets the road, what
Mhm.
does that look like i- within yourself?
Yeah.
um
And part of the role of a chaplain too is how do I, from my perspective, in whatever faith I bring, meet you where you are
mhm.
in whatever faith experience you bring, because those can be very different things.
Right, it's not like they're not going to have somebody on call for every single like
Right.
system.
Like I've attended to um, patients of very different faiths. I won't share
Mhm.
specifics, but
Yeah.
you know, definitely you have to be able to meet people where they're at. And so that's kind of the thing I enjoyed about chaplaincy is
Mhm.
I could be a little bit more broad in how I talked about. I still am to some extent. I definitely, being in the local church, I very much anchor myself in the doctrine and polity of the United Methodist Church, um, and yet that also gives me an opportunity to then look out into the world and to say, you know, there's a lot of good, I think, in the world that
Mhm.
comes from those different places and perspectives.
Yeah. And you brought something up that brings me to my next question, which
Mhm.
is,
Can you break down Methodism in like the broadest terms and how it connects with all of the offshoots?
Yeah. So, the way that the United Methodist Church started is it was John and Charles Wesley were two brothers who were two of like 17 children that Samuel and Susanna Wesley had. Now, Samuel was a priest in the Church of England in the 1700s, if I'm remembering my centuries correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And so faith was very much part of that family. And I give a lot of credit to Susanna because the story is that she would like meet with each of her 17 kids every single day, and they would have like their individual time. Now, of course, some didn't survive past infancy, but she was very intentional about that and the faith formation. So Charles and Samuel went to Oxford, and they were studying to become priests themselves. And this was kind of at a time where the church had been in its form for a while after Henry VIII said, "Forget you," to the Roman Catholic Church, and um, they were looking for something more in their lives, right? They were like, this just going to mass on Sunday just isn't enough for us. I don't know if they would have used the term mass, but they probably maintained a lot of the same language. And so they started this group of young men they called it the Holy Club, and their goal was to just hold each other accountable, to help each other grow in their faith, encourage each other. And other people looked in on that and they said, "Oh, you Methodists, you have a method for everything." And because they had this very like stricture of, here's how we're gonna do this, here's how we're gonna grow in our lives, and all of that. And so that was kind of where we get the name Methodist. And then there's some story about John coming over to Georgia, what is today Georgia, and was not very successful because he had a run in with one of the ladies there who had some pretty high up power, and he liked her and was trying to build connections with her, and she didn't like that too much, and so he refused her access to communion. That didn't go over very well, and so he goes back home. He doesn't do so great, but when the American Revolution happens, the Methodist movement has already kind of started in what would become America, the United States. And he said, we're not going to just leave these people without their clergy, because he still very much encouraged people to attend church and things like that. And so when the king basically pulled out all of the Anglican church clergy, he said, "You know what, we're going to continue to do our thing." He didn't want to, but he was kind of like, we have to at this point. And so then he sent Coke and Asbury and I forget their names, but I think it's Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury. There we go.
Okay.
And that's where the United Methodist Publishing House today is called Cokesbury.
Okay.
And so they came over, they were bishops, they were made into bishops, and then we had what was called the Christmas Conference, and the Methodist Church as we knew it came into being. At the same time, you also had Philip Otterbein, who started what would later become the Evangelical United Brethren.
Okay.
The theologically they were pretty much similar, and John and Philip would sometimes be in communication. The real difference was just that they worshipped in German versus in English. And so those come along. The Methodist Church in the Civil War time goes through a split between North and South. They come back together. I'm giving you the quick rundown of.
Oh no, I appreciate this.
This is like the long Methodist history.
Oh yeah.
In a few minutes, as fast as I can.
Yeah.
So they come back together in 1939, and you have the Methodist Church, and then you have the Evangelical United Brethren that has kind of come together from a few different groups. And then in 1968, the two groups come together and they form what we call today the United Methodist church. And so that's why we have United from the Evangelical United Brethren. And sometimes the joke is that the EUB, the only thing that they kept was the United. You know, the Methodists kind of did a lot of their theology and things like that. What's interesting, though, is that I serve in two communities, and one of the communities I serve in, we actually have two buildings, because one was the EUB and one was the Methodist. And they had to come together, and there was history around the fact that you know, they were two different congregations, and now they had to figure out how to get along with each other. And so, you know, it's kind of funny when you look back at the history. That's only been about 60 years ago. You know, or 53, really, actually, if I do the math right, from 1968 to now. And so and now we're looking at another interesting point in our history, which I won't get into a lot of, but just to say we are wrestling with what it means to be a global church in the 21st century. And all of the anxieties and power politics and all of the history that comes with that. So
yeah, thank you for that summary. I wanted to that is what I wanted, because it's just fascinating to see where these things came from. And I, as like a Unitarian Universalist with that whole, you know, background situation, it's cool to have that context. And I didn't realize that United Methodist Church formed in like 1968, because that's like around when Unitarian Universalism like merged. So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So.
And then the other thing I didn't mention in the history, but it kind of is a launching point into kind of the music connection here, is that I'm convinced that it wasn't even so much John and all that he did for the church as it was Charles, who wrote like 1,000+ different poems / hymns. You know, he wrote a lot of the lyrics, and then they later on became hymns. Not all of them were set to music, but a number of them were. And the legend is that some of the tunes that they were set to were bar tunes that they would have sung to, you know. So I have always had, as I hold this up to the camera, I know we're audio here, but this is my favorite book in the whole world, really, in some ways. It is the United Methodist Hymnal, and there is just like a treasure trove of really good stuff in here. This one in particular actually came from my campus ministry in Lincoln.
Oh, cool.
And I was given that as I was graduating, because they were going to be closing, and of course, what do you do with all this stuff? And I was going into seminary, and so it was like, it just made sense for me to have my own hymnal. A couple of really interesting, I'm just going to go off here because it's fun stuff.
Do it. That's what we do here.
It is fun. You're going to get a kick out of this. So before we even get to the song that I want to talk about, in the very introduction, we have an excerpt from John Wesley's Select Hymns 1761, and it is called Directions for Singing.
Oh, good.
Okay. Number 1, learn these tunes before you learn any others. Afterwards, learn as many as you can, or as you please. Number 2, sing them exactly as they are printed here, without altering or mending them at all. And if you have learned to sing them otherwise, unlearn it as soon as you can. Number 3, I know, this is just hilarious. I read it and it's like, oh my gosh, this is fun stuff.
Oh, man.
My confirmation kids always get a kick out of this when I talk to them about the hymnal. Number 3, sing all. See that you join with the congregation as frequently as you can. Let not a slight degree of weakness or weariness hinder you. If it is a cross to you, take it up, and you will find it a blessing. Sing lustily. Number 4, sing lustily and with good courage. Beware of singing as if you were half dead or half asleep, but lift up your voice with strength. Be no more afraid of your voice now, nor more ashamed of its being heard, than when you sung the songs of Satan. I know.
Can you reread that?
Yes. I'll start back at the beginning of that one.
Oh, yes.
Sing lustily and with good courage. Beware of singing as if you were half dead or half asleep, but lift up your voice with strength. Be no more afraid of your voice now, nor more ashamed of its being heard than when you sang the songs of Satan.
Cool.
I know. Number 5, sing modestly. Do not bawl so as to be heard above or distinct from the rest of the congregation, that you may not destroy the harmony, but strive to unite your voices together so as to make one clear, melodious sound. Number 6, sing in time. Whatever time is to be sung, be sure to keep with it. Do not run before nor stay behind it, but attend close to the leading voices and move therewith as exactly as you can. And take care not to sing too slow. This drawling way naturally steals on all who are lazy, and it is high time to drive it out from us and sing all our tunes just as quick as we did at first. And number 7, this is my favorite one. Above all, sing spiritually. Have an eye to God in every word you sing. Aim at pleasing Him, gender language, more than yourself or any other creature. In order to do this, attend strictly to the sense of what you sing, and see that your heart is not carried away with the sound, but offered to God continually. So shall your singing be such as the Lord will approve here, and reward you when He cometh in the clouds of heaven. So I
Yeah.
like how it's like it's a whole bunch of funny, and then at the end it does get kind of, there's truth to it.
Yeah.
Sing spiritually. I've always loved music, and for me, as I'm designing worship now that I serve in a local church, I pay a lot of attention to what the lyrics are to a song, and I try to pick songs that are going to connect with the message of what we're talking about with for the day. And you definitely do get those people who are like, well, I don't know this song.
Mm-hmm.
Try it, you might
Yeah.
learn it.
Yeah, it's so interesting, the language of that, because it is simultaneously like encouraging the group mind of like, we let's all focus in and connect with each other and be present, but then it's also there's a lot of crowd control happening there, and there's a lot of uh like
Don't be
those.
the church lady who sings really high pitch above everybody and
Yeah, yeah. Oh my goodness, it reminds me of a sermon that a previous minister gave at my church about the cultural implications of the 2 and the 4 and the 1 and the 3, and basically, it was basically all about like rhythm and culture, but it was also low key to get for us to get it together when like singing This Little Light of Mine, because the songs that we sing from more from spirituals and African
Mhm.
traditions like are going to have that 2 and the 4, but marches and like stuff from the Western tradition has
The 1 and the
either
3.
1 in the 3 or like a 1 2 3 4 march beat, which is why Caucasian rhythm disorder is a thing.
I
And
like
that's
it.
and that's my favorite fact. But one
I
of
can
the things,
believe it.
yeah, but one of
Yeah.
the bits in there was some people are meant to hold the hymnal, and I was just like, there's so much shade happening here, and it's
Yeah,
also great.
that's awesome.
Anyway, I love that thank you for sharing that breakdown. And I love hearing that. I guess I hadn't thought of the the fact that so many of the Methodist hymns like were written by like the founders. Like, that's wild.
Yeah.
Um
And again, I would say that was really the reason that the theology spread,
mm,
was that people naturally singing reaches a different part of your brain,
Mm.
I think. It connects in a different way. Like I could give up and give a 20-minute sermon and people will forget it like that.
Mm-hmm.
But you sing one song, and if it's got enough of a rhythm and the words mean something, it sticks,
Yeah.
you know?
No, absolutely. And I think that even when, you're in my experience, like even like with the Catholic hymns, like I will still listen, like the Catholic hymns still give me feelings. I'm not particularly Catholic anymore,
Hmm.
but there's a feeling of home that happens.
Hmm.
Um
Is there a particular one for you, or?
oh my goodness. I mean, on Eagle's Wings has been
Hmm.
discussed on the internet that is a solid Catholic banger. There was a whole meme about it.
Yeah.
Um, and Here I Am, Lord. That one's
Mm.
that one's
That
classic.
I have to admit, when we were talking about songs, that was a close tie for me
Oh,
of
really?
another one. Yeah. We have that in our hymnal too. And they kind of pull that out. Like we used it at my seminary graduation, we used it at ordination services,
Hmm.
all of those things, because it really is about a call and answering one's call.
Yeah, that one really, like, that one speaks to me, and like I can, and is like the easiest to sort through all
Mhm,
the, you know the parts where I might differ. It's just like that connection of that song has really just,
mhm.
yeah. There's I have a playlist of Catholic hymns that's on Spotify
Nice.
that I will listen to sometimes, and
Mhm,
that's where I roll. But I wanted to talk about the particular hymn you wanted to talk about
mhm.
was "Oh for a Thousand Tongues to Sing."
Yeah. And so a little bit of the history behind that again, and it ties in with kind of some of the history I've already given.
Mm-hmm.
So the story is on May 24th, I forget the year, but John Wesley had always kind of wrestled with his faith and his salvation, in whatever term you want to describe that as. He always was worried about that. He had been invited to attend a meeting on Aldersgate Street in England, and of this group of people, and they were reading Martin Luther's commentary on the Epistle to the Romans, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he, in his journal, describes that his heart was strangely warmed, and he knew that even I, had received the assurance, or I'm forgetting the exact words, but basically, he said his heart was strangely warmed. Those are the exact words there, and just that he always felt that was a faith moment for him.
Mm-hmm.
But the story that Celeste told, again, because brother's got a brother,
Mm-hmm.
Charles Wesley had been there a few days previously and had had his own experience, and he wrote this whole hymn. We today we call it "Oh for a Thousand Tongues to Sing," but in the on the next page of the hymnal, we have it's called "Glory to God and Praise and Love," and there's a whole bunch more verses to it, and that was his expression of his experience of assurance and faith and the Holy Spirit, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's funny that sometimes Pentecost happens on exactly the same day as Aldersgate Day,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And so he wrote this whole hymn of like a whole bunch of verses about his experience and how, you know, just this sense of just outpouring of praise to God.
Mm-hmm.
If it kind of reminds me of like, um I regret that I only have but one life to give, kind of thing. It kind of
Mm-hmm.
has that spirit for me. Um, and just some of the lyrics to it are really neat. But that hymn has always been it's always by tradition the first hymn of every United Methodist hymnal,
Mm-hmm.
um, or every Methodist before they became United Methodists. And it's been that way because that hymn is kind of like the foundation of our faith, and so um, it's just a really neat song, and it's one for me. The experience of it was I always liked singing it, but then there's nothing like singing it when you're singing it at either our clergy gathering or at our annual conference, which is another way of referring to the term annual conference, where every year we get together and there's like a whole bunch of clergy and a whole bunch of representatives of all the local churches, and we have worship and we debate resolutions and we do the business together. And singing "Oh for a Thousand Tongues" with 1,000 plus people, there's just something about that moment of singing it together that's just really beautiful.
Hmm.
And so for me, I just think of that connection and um yeah.
That's wow. I did not. Okay, so this hymn has its own holiday, basically.
Sort of. I mean, the hymn itself doesn't so much, but like we go off of John Wesley's experience because he wrote it down in his journal, and John Wesley kind of gets all the credit.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so we call it Aldersgate Day, and that's May 24th every
Uh-huh.
year, and it just remembers that was kind of that experience of his heart being strangely warmed.
Nice.
And this hymn kind of is Charles's own experience of that as well.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, there's something super cool about what I think is super powerful about that it too is that it is a description of what inspiration feels like viscerally
mhm,
in this way that is accessible,
mhm,
which I don't know if that always happens when we're getting in the weeds about theology and what we're
mhm.
supposed to believe. And I think that's super important and super cool.
Yeah,
So,
it's easy to get in our head and theoretical. I'm very much the like you said earlier, the
mhm,
rubber's got to meet the road. The you
mhm,
have this stuff is lived out,
mhm,
and that's what's so cool. I think about being a pastor, is really we get to be a part of people's lives and speak into it in so many different ways through worship and song and scripture and just sitting by those bedsides, through celebrating births, welcoming new members into the body through baptism, gathering around the table as we celebrate communion. Just all of those things are just sometimes the coolest thing I think about being a pastor is that trust that
mhm,
I have, that people invite me into some of the most sacred and most intimate moments of their
mm,
lives.
yeah.
So,
Um, yeah, that's and it's so important to like those moments of presence and community is really like I think what it's all about, and and like that's part of why we engage with the church
mhm.
is to
Well,
have
and
that.
and right now we're into a real debate about that and what
Mm,
that's going to look like, given the fact that we've now gone a year plus of having church online or in parking lots or in different ways that we've tried to navigate. And now we have to ask ourselves, what will it look like?
mhm.
You know?
Have you how has that transition been with online worship?
Um, it was there's definitely some challenges because you definitely have some folks who are not as connected technologically, and you have to understand some of that. And so we tried to find ways to like we might mail sermons or those kinds of things, bulletins, just try to keep connected in those ways. And then, I got pretty used to being on the camera for Facebook Live
Mhm.
for doing services that way. But I also knew that it was a different medium. And so I knew I had to kind of adjust how worship looked. One of the things that was the hardest because it's harder to include as part of worship was the music part.
Mm.
And part of that was the copyright thing that we still hadn't quite gotten all of that arranged yet. We got there as we started opening back up and we're going to be doing music. But then part of it is also it is a lot harder to sing as just one person. I can do it. It's also a very scary and intimidating thing to do.
Yeah.
on your own. So,
And that's something I've experienced with my, so we do like Zoom worship where
mhm,
um I miss I like I'll be singing alone at home, and like I keep trying to find ways to make the ritual happen. Like
mm.
I'm still like standing up when I need to stand up, and I'm like,
No, that's legitimate. I mean, like, that's I try to encourage people to do that. When
yeah.
we were still gathering from our homes, I would try to say something like, close out all the other tabs on your browsers, make a space and a time, set the I think intentionality is something that is really hard but really critical
Mhm.
in this past year, where some of those boundaries that we used to create have kind of gotten shredded apart. Um,
Yeah. Like I'm the sort of person who it's like I'll turn off my phone before going into a show or going into church, and it's so interesting like living the Zoom life and everybody's in the chat, and it's like, oh, I want to focus on the moment.
yeah. And yet the interesting thing is that, sometimes that can be a form of community itself.
Yeah.
Because there's been some times I fully confess that I may or may not have at times been on Facebook chat with other clergy people as we're sitting in annual conference
Mhm.
session and trying to kind of just keep ourselves alert and attentive to what's going on. And so I think for the most part, we really use it as a tool to help us engage. But I think each person has to kind of determine for themselves what's going to help them stay connected or not. And so, yeah, you get this kind of like sub community that happens on on the Facebook that way, or just different things. So,
Yeah, yeah. No, it's interesting how the rituals shift and change, and that's been like a really
yeah.
that's been a really interesting thing to see. Um,
Yeah. And then,
so I wanted to go back to, so going back to the music, you were
mhm,
talking about that imagery of like the his heart was warm, that
mhm.
John Wesley's heart was warm. Um, and I'm curious, how do you describe, like, how does inspiration and that you feel from music or theater, like, where does that live in your body?
I would probably say it lives in my heart as well. I think I also think of like the in the air. I think there's just kind of this. It's not a buzz, but like just this warm feeling in the air that we have, like when there's a bunch of people together. I'm one of those people who's pretty empathic, and so I can kind of get a feel for the mood of a room. And
Mm-hmm.
so, it's just there is something about feeling that next to you you have other people who are singing, um and all of that. And so that's kind of where it lives for me. The other way that I experience inspiration is kind of like I talked about with my own call story, of that I think of it like that still small voice in the back of my head, and it still sounds like my voice, but it's also there's something about it that it's like, if I trust that God has created me to be who I am and I live into that fully, then I am answering what God is calling me to do, you know? And
Yeah.
so, um, and that was a lot of when I was going through that process in college. I was like, okay, what am I good at? What do I enjoy doing? Where do I spend my time just naturally? Because I trust that the Spirit is working in that, you know?
Yeah. And I like that I mean, still small voice is like a classic term.
Mhm. Yeah,
But,
it's in
or what does
the
it say
Elijah
here?
in the cave, I think.
Oh, okay. That,
Yeah, there's the big rushing wind, and after that there was the fire and all of this, and then but God was not in those things.
yes.
Instead, God was in the still small voice, and that's, I think, also an underrated part of worship. And it's a lot harder when you're doing it online we call it dead space in radio
Mm,
or sound. We don't like that so much, but I am a huge fan of creating opportunities for silence. And so I didn't struggle nearly as much with the pandemic, I think, as some people have in
Mm-hmm.
that regard, because I'm very strongly introverted. It's just who I am, which doesn't mean I don't like people. I absolutely do. It just means that by the time I'm done being around a bunch of them, I'm kind of drained and I'm going to have to put my feet up and cuddle under a nice warm blanket and watch something fun. You know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and oh man. Well, I have discovered that I am actually an introvert, despite the fact that I enjoy talking. This
yeah.
pandemic has taught me that I'm an introvert.
Yeah.
And it has really helped me find that still small voice place as well. So I agree with that, and I think that is such an important thing to figure out, because there can be a lot of thoughts swirling in your head. So figuring out
Yes.
what is the wise voice
Mm.
is like its own journey. And I definitely attribute that to something that one goes through in your 20s, which I say with all the wisdom of a 33-year-old. But
Right?
but
So,
it's a constant journey, and figuring
mhm.
out how to go back to that is so important, and it just makes me think of there's a Teresa of, I think it's Teresa of Avila.
Mhm.
So you can probably fact check me on this, but but I think it's Teresa of Avila said, talked about the idea that your soul is like this mansion with many rooms.
Yeah, the interior castle.
Interior castle. There it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She talked about like 7 different mansions inside, and I've started to read that and I need to go back and do it because I do like her a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I resonate with a lot of there are women theologians throughout history. Surprise.
Surprise. Now you know, listeners. Now you know. Yeah, Teresa of Avila is one of the I went through a phase sometime in college where I just started collecting books about different mystics. So I have like Julian of Norwich, Hildegard von Bingen,
Yeah.
uh
I
all
did
of
my
that.
senior capstone on women's rhetoric on Julian of Norwich because I did the women's rhetoric class, and
Uh-huh.
I did my research on Julian, and then I actually my contribution project was preaching
Mhm.
for Cornerstone. you know, hello women preaching, kind of a radical thing in itself. So, uh,
Yeah.
and I will say in the Methodist movement we have had our mixed history there as well. John Wesley actually had a number of women who served as preachers and exhorters and all these different roles. Over time, there was a time where women weren't really allowed, and then finally, that was part of the process again. And so we've kind of 1956, I think, is when that happened as part
Mhm.
of the Methodist Church. There are still congregations that struggle with that. And personally, I think they're missing out on half of the divine.
Absolutely. And I think that at least what I've read from these different mystics is they are so good at tapping into the imagery and the poetry and the visceralness of theology, which is so important in getting us back into our bodies and
Yeah.
that finding that truth, because you can't there I think this is a Richard Rohr quote, but Richard Rohr said that an epiphany is just embodying something you already know.
Mm, I like that.
Yeah,
I like that.
and I think that's part of the deal with music and how it connects us to our spirituality and our faith, is it it gets us in our bodies and we experience it and we sing
Yeah,
along.
it's a very
And
physical thing to sing.
yeah.
It's so I'm not a professional singer by any stretch, but I know my way around singing just by
Mhm.
by experience, I suppose. And yeah, it's just knowing where to breathe from, how to hold, just all those things. And I'm not like I said, I'm not professional by any stretch, but it is, as you say that, I'm like, yeah, it's a very embodied thing to sing.
Yeah. And so much, and I mean, it's the one instrument where your confidence and your willingness to use it, it affects how you use it. Like you
Mhm.
can psych yourself out with singing. Like I'll tell
Yeah.
my students, like if I ever am coaching somebody who's like, I'm not really a singer, I'll be like, shh, it'll hear
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Makes me
Well,
think of like finding my voice as a preacher even too. It's a
mm,
similar kind of process.
yeah, and it's a lot of it is, yeah, just getting comfortable and putting stuff out there, getting comfortable with how everything works, and learning to trust yourself and all that good stuff.
Absolutely.
Um, So, Michelle, thank you for being on the show today. And you host another podcast on this little network that we're starting here.
Yes. I am working with Father Andrew Miller, and we are doing Pastor and a Priest Walk into a Movie Theater, where we talk about movies and their connection with faith and life, and try to think theologically about that as well. And so it's been, it's funny. I thought of that idea, and then it kind of spiraled into this network, and I was like, how in the world did this happen? But I just had this crazy idea and it's kind of blossomed from here. But it's also really exciting because I think what I see in this is God is at work in so many ways in our lives. And the more ways that we can name that and point to that, I think that's an opportunity to resonate with people. And so we're looking at, so far we've recorded for Moana, Sister Act, we'll be doing True Grit. We've done The Day After, and so there's different. We're not just going after like the cliche like God's not dead kind of movies. We're actually going for like movies that you normally see that have life faith themes to them. And so we're having a lot of fun with that. And I am so glad to be a part of that. And I'm so glad that you have given me a chance to be here with you today. I love this conversation. So
Yeah, this is great conversation. Um, yeah, and I'm so excited to start this network. Yeah, I was brought into it out of a Facebook post, which like this was, definitely one of those universe moments. I feel like when people of faith have magical synchronicity moments, there's like some sort of bonus credit that you get.
right?
Like
Yeah. Well, and it's funny you use that word synchronicity because I'm like, there are times when I've heard the same thing from different people.
mhm.
And that's when I'm like, okay, I'm paying attention. I get it.
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, so I like that we were just sort of guided together, or, said yes to creating this network. So it's
Yeah.
great. Alrighty. Well, you can check out Michelle and Andrew's podcast also on the New Faith New Media Network. Priest and a Pastor Walk into a Movie Theater. And are there any other ways you want people to connect with you?
Well, we're working on setting up all of our socials, and so Facebook is kind of the first place that I know of, and I know that we're working on more. So stay tuned as we get
Yeah.
started. I think we're going to be setting up Patreon and all of
Yeah,
those
we
things.
we
So
we've set up we've set up those things, and the links to those things will be in the show notes. So you can connect with us through all of the New Faith New Media channels, and also join the discussion on our Facebook group. Awesome. Well, thank you, Michelle.
oh, you're so welcome. Thank you, Gail.
Thank you for listening to Faith and What Resonates. The theme music for the show is My Journey, My Song, the first song that I wrote back when I was 19. The song has an epic backstory, and I'll tell you about it in a future episode. Faith and What Resonates is part of the New Faith New Media Network. You can find out more about what we do by checking out our Facebook page. You can also discuss this and other episodes in our Facebook group. That's also where you can connect with Michelle and find out where to listen to her show, A Pastor and a Priest Walk into a Movie Theater. If you like what we do and you want to support that work directly, you can support the New Faith New Media Network on Patreon. All Patreon supporters get access to our Patreon exclusive podcast, Blessed Lunatics. If you want to know more about the things I do in the world, you can head to my website, gailgallaghermusic.com. Thanks for listening, and remember to stay curious and keep following the magic of the things that resonate.